Welcome to the Business Interview. I'm Markus Karlsson. This week, I'm speaking to the president of the World Bank. Robert Zoellick took the reins of the bank in 2007, and to say the past 5 years have been eventful is probably an understatement. President Zoellick has led the organization through the financial crisis, a food crisis, as well as the Arab Spring. And as he's now preparing to leave office on the 1st of July, the Eurozone debt crisis threatens to derail the global economy. President Zoellick is with us now from the World Bank's headquarters in Washington, D.C. Mr. President, thanks very much indeed for speaking to France 24.
I'm glad to be with you.
Now, as I said, these past 5 years, they've certainly been eventful. What kind of threat in your mind, though, does the Eurozone debt crisis actually pose at this stage?
Well, I think we're at a really fragile moment, not only for the European economy, but for its effects globally. And there are various cracks of uncertainty that you can see are frightening markets, not only in Europe, but in the developing world as well. And I think, obviously, people will be watching the Greek elections, see what comes out of that, see whether there's a further negotiation, and in a very worst case, if Greece decides to leave the euro, then the risks of contagion of that to other banks. But I think the most important issue actually is the one about trying to help the Spanish and Italian governments be able to undertake their reforms. The reforms they're taking are going to take some time, and so they need some medium-term financing that is matched with the length of the reforms, and that's the piece that I think Europe hasn't yet solved yet.
I was just going to ask, you speak there of cracks of uncertainty. There's been so much criticism of how Eurozone leaders have handled this crisis. Is Europe at this stage actually taking real steps towards resolving it?
Well, I think Europe has taken real steps, but given some of the challenges of the 17 countries in the Eurozone and the sort of relatively young institutions, they've always been a day late and a euro short. And I think that's the problem. Even with the recent infusion of capital into the Spanish banks, there were questions of, is it done to the EFS? Is it done to the ESM? And these just added uncertainty. So the challenge for Europe is actually to use the tools it's been deploying, but to get ahead of the problem, to build confidence, and to give time in these countries to undertake the reforms. So the Germans are half right. You have to deal with the fiscal consolidation. You have to fix the pension and labor systems. But where I think they haven't been as forward-leaning as they need to be is to try to give the financial support for these countries while they take these reforms.
It sounds as if you're saying that the Spanish banking bailout is far from enough. What needs to be done though, in your mind? Could you set out a roadmap for us, if you will?
Well, first off, Europe has to be prepared for what comes out of the Greek situation. And so these are the risks of the types of things that happened in 2008 with Lehman Brothers. So that's protect the banking system, if need be, provide the liquidity support to the European Central Bank. And if you find a situation where depositors start to leave, you have to make the types of support like a stronger deposit insurance. But those buy time. The most important one is the fact that as countries undertake their reforms, there are various ideas out there. I'm not suggesting a full use of Eurobonds because I think that would remove the discipline. But there's things about how you could try to have partial use of Eurobonds as countries make reforms, how you could try to take some of their debt over 60% of GDP and fund it. But the key concept is the need to make sure that as they do the right things, they can finance themselves in markets. And what you're seeing is the markets are starting to make that harder and harder. And then there's some things that I and others talked about demand from, say, the European Investment Bank, the European Commission's cohesion and structural funds, getting that money out, because we're now in an era where the politics are as important as the economics, and you need to support the politics of reform.
I'm interested in when you say that there's a need for a partial use of Eurobonds. Germany, of course, has been dead against any kind of use of Eurobonds so far. The pressure has been rising on Germany and its Chancellor Angela Merkel in particular. You've even said that there's no other choice for Germany but to lead Europe out of this crisis.
Yes, well, this is an example of trying to get ahead of the problem. I don't believe that the Eurozone will ultimately be successful unless there's broader support for the Spanish and Italian reforms. And so there are a number of tools out there, including one that Chancellor Merkel has talked about, where one might take the debt above 60% of GDP, put it in a pool and finance it, giving them time. Well, fine. If you're willing to take that step, take it. Get ahead of the problem so we don't have this situation where Europe actually puts substantial sums of money in, does substantial actions, but it's always too late and it doesn't have the same effect and it doesn't reassure Europeans on the future. So where the Germans, I think, have a fair point is they don't want to be using their credit to fund everybody that doesn't make reforms, and they have their own politics. But I think where they haven't been as advanced as I wish they would be is use some of the things that they're being dragged to, but use them up front to try to shape the nature of the political response. And I think France, actually the new French government could play a very important role in this, because the history of Europe is one where the Franco-German relationship is key, and I think the new government will have to walk a very fine line. On the one hand, they can use that relationship to push for some of these steps that I've been talked about. If France and Germany lead in Europe, that will be very significant politically. On the other hand, if France takes some of the economic steps that weaken the economy, then it will become part of the problem. And that would certainly not help us get out of this overall mess.
What happens, though, if Germany doesn't listen to France? What happens if Germany doesn't give in, simply put?
Well, then we're running bigger risks, and we'll follow the same pattern we've followed, which is that you move to the brinksmanship of a crisis, and then you hope that at the last minute, whether it's the ECB, the European Central Bank, or some other package, sort of bails out the problem. But my view is that actually adds the risks over time and doesn't deal with the fundamentals. So I'm not saying this is an easy problem. This is extremely difficult. You've got a number of different elements. So I'm not trying to be critical of the leaders. But after the course of some 3 years, I think the world is waiting for Europe to save Europe.
Now, we've got a G20 summit coming up in the next week or so. Does the international community, does the G20 need to take concerted action against the Eurozone debt crisis at this stage? Or is this, at the moment at least, simply a European problem?
Well, it's certainly not just a European problem, and I expect the Europeans will hear a lot, not only from the North Americans, but from developing countries, because over the past few months, we've started to see the greater effects on the developing countries. They've provided about 2/3 of global growth over the past 5 years, but now they're starting to slow down. We at the bank have warned them about various things they have to use to prepare for the uncertainties. And then obviously in Europe's neighborhood, the Balkans, Southeastern Europe, North Africa, going through these revolutions, some of the African countries, they're getting the wave or shock effects. And that's an area where the bank can help. We've been trying to provide additional financial support for their banking systems and trade finance and other steps. So this is not just a European problem, but Europe is the key to the solution.
Now, you're preparing to step down after 5 years at the helm of the World Bank. What's the number one lesson that you're taking away from this experience?
Well, the world has changed so quickly. It was happening before I took office, but now it's really gone into hyperspeed with this financial crisis, where the developing countries are no longer charity or solidarity cases. They're key to the future success of the world economy, but they still have a lot of development problems. So I've tried to orient the bank to treat them as clients, not trying to lecture them that there's only a few policies, but try to understand their problems, maybe infrastructure, maybe human development, maybe trade. And increasingly, there's some good lessons drawn from other developing countries. For example, some of the social safety net policies that have been done with real fiscal efficiency in Mexico and Brazil, we've now helped expand to some 40 other countries.
And do you think that's the legacy you're going to leave at the bank?
Well, I'm hoping that my tenure will be noted for the turnaround. I came in at a point of problem. As you mentioned, we've tried to respond in an effective way on the food and fuel crisis, but then to lay the platform of modernization for the future. We had a new capital increase. We've got some additional funding for the poorest countries, and we've tried to open up and transform the institution. So the nature of institutions is the job never stops, but I'm pleased with what we've been able to accomplish over the past few years.
What awaits you now, Mr. President? What are you going to do next?
Well, I've still got this G20 meeting, and when I step down, I will probably have some associations with some universities and others, and then I'll try to see where I might be able to also help my country. I've been trying to do some things on the bipartisan side with our own budget problems, which are also significant.
What's the number one piece of advice that you'd like to give your successor, Dr. Jim Yong Kim? He, of course, he's been criticised as he's now taking the reins. There was a debate as he was elected whether or not it was time to choose a candidate from the developing world. What's your number one piece of advice, as I say?
Well, you know, I do believe when you step down, you should step down. You should let the new person come in and bring their fresh ideas. But I think this point, which will be natural to him, of treating developing countries as clients, trying to come up with practical problem-solving solutions, just as we've talked about in the European context. So this is beyond a realm of ideology or textbook theories, but try to understand the political economy of countries, and particularly because this crisis is ongoing and something I think we're going to feel the shock effects for years to come. We need to help the poorer countries get through it. We need to help the middle-income countries become sources of growth to help developed countries too.
All right, President Robert Zoellick of the World Bank, thanks very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us today. And with that, we're going to wrap up the business interview. Thanks to you for watching, and do stay with us here at France 24.